What's up, buddy? Welcome to Shark Jets. I'm Skidviz. In this episode, I'm going to teach you about using Sqlite databases with C#. In this scenario, we're going to be using it on a Discord bot, but it will also work in a Unity game or anything like that that's using C#. So the main thing to think about here is Sqlite right for you? You know, maybe ask your doctor. But Sqlite is a very good database for really simple stuff. If you have like an iPhone or something, like all of the data on there is managed on Sqlite databases. They're just a simple file instead of a whole database system. It's a file that contains all the data. And it's just as good as any other database, except it's not made for a lot of concurrent connections. So that's the biggest issue with it. So if you're going to expect to be hitting it thousands of times per second, this is not the database you want to be using. You want to be using something like MySQL or Microsoft SQL or some other database that supports concurrent connections. But in our scenario, I'm just making a little bot, right? I just need a few connections to it every now and then. So it's fine. So I'm going to set up how to use it in .NET using the entity framework so that you don't have to write a lot of SQL commands. You can just use the standard stuff you're used to, .add, just like it's a list item or something. So let's go ahead and do that. But first, you know what to do. Like and subscribe. All right, let's get started. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio. The first thing you want is a working bot. So if you don't have a working bot, go to this link and learn how to make a bot. So as we can see, my bot is working. I have it so that it posts a message to this channel whenever I start it up. So that's how I know it's running fine. So in order to use Sqlite, we're going to need a couple of NuGet packages. So let's go to Manage NuGet Packages. And you'll want to install the several following packages. We'll want Microsoft.EntityFramework Core. You'll want Microsoft.EntityFramework Core.Design. You'll want Microsoft.EntityFramework Core Tools. And of course, you'll want Microsoft.EntityFramework Core Sqlite, which is different from Microsoft.Data.Sqlite. So there's two different ones. You don't need this .data one. You need this .EntityFramework Core one. So make sure you have all those installed before you proceed. So now that we have all those packages installed, we want to create a context. A context is what tells the client, the application, how to use the database. So I have a specific folder that I keep my contexts in. I have multiple contexts because I'm using multiple databases. But in your case, you can put it wherever you want, but it's nice to be organized. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new class here. And I'm going to call it Sqlite context. Cool. Now the Sqlite context is going to inherit from DB context. So make sure to put that there. If your Visual Studio doesn't automatically add this using Microsoft Entity Framework Core to the top, then make sure to add it yourself, because otherwise you'll get errors. It won't know what you're talking about. Okay, so now we need to override the default configuration. A lot of people put their database initialization in the startup because that's where configuration usually goes, but we're going to put it in the context itself since it's localized that way. That's just how I like to do it. So we're going to override the default configuring. Let me type that in real quick. Okay, so let's go over this really quickly. It's a protected method, so we add protected. We're overriding the default on configuring. It has a return of nothing, so it's a void. It's called onConfiguring. It takes one parameter, which is a DB context options builder. I'm calling that variable options. And then I'm setting that to tell it to use Sqlite. If you were using Microsoft SQL Server, you would use SQL Server instead. If you were using MySQL, you would use MySQL. So we're using Sqlite, so we say use Sqlite. And then we tell it where the data source is, which in our case, there's no username and password, it's just a database. So we just specify the file name to the database and say that's the data source. Really quick and simple. Now we're gonna need objects to fetch and save. So we're gonna need a model. So I have a folder here called models. I don't know where you're gonna keep your stuff, but it's nice to be organized. So in here, I'm gonna create a new model, and that's just another class. And I'm gonna call this muted user. Because in my case, I want to keep track of users who are not allowed to speak anymore. So it's a muted user. When you're dealing with database items, relational databases, except more specifically, everything has an ID. And so if you're following along with Dapper Dino's bot making course or videos, you'll see that he created a entity class, which is a good idea. And now I created this also. It's just a simple model called entity. It has just one thing in it, right? And that is an integer called ID, because every row in a database has an ID. So why not just put it here, and that way you don't have to worry about adding it to all your models. So just add it here, set it to a key. You'll need this component model annotations at the top. Just create this like that. It's an abstract class, so you can't actually create an entity, but you can inherit off of it. So we will pretend that you did that. And then our muted user, we're going to inherit that entity like so. Now all that's doing is it's saying that every muted user has what this guy has, right? And we saw that all it has is an ID. So we want to just put that in there. That way we don't have to worry about adding IDs to all of our models. Groovy. So we're going to need some properties, right? And I don't know if you know the shortcut. If you type prop and then hit tab, it'll automatically create the property initializer, and you just have to set the values for it. So we're going to use our member ID, which might be an integer or a long or a float or whatever. Who knows what your ID is? But in my case, I'm just going to save them as strings because I don't know what they're going to be. So it's safe to just be safe with strings. So I'm going to save this as a string. I'm going to call it member ID. And that's that. We already have a property on muted user called member ID. The next thing I'm going to save is the reason why the user got muted. So I'm going to do the same thing, except create the property muted reason. All right, so like I said, another property, it's a string called muted reason. The third thing is going to be the most important thing, right? It's going to be how long is the user muted for? So we'll do a prop again. All right, so this time we're going to do something a little different. It's still public. It's now a date time instead of a string. We're going to store a date and a time, which determines when the user gets unmuted. So we call that muted expiration. You can call it whatever you want. Now we're done here. So we'll save this, and we'll go back to our Sqlite context. Now in here, we've overridden this configuration, telling it to use Sqlite. But now we also have to tell it what kind of items we're expecting to get back from the database. So I'm going to go in here and create a set, right? There's a thing called a DB set, which basically means it's going to be more than one item or one or more items. And you need to tell it what those items are going to be. So we'll do a public db set. And when you do this, it's going to want these braces, and that's where you tell it what kind of entity you're creating or you're expecting. So we created that model called muted user, so we will add muted user here. Get out of the way. All right, muted user there, and we got to name the property, so I'm going to call it muted users plural. Okay. Now this is a property just like all the other ones, so you need a get set. So now our Sqlite context knows to find muted user, and it returns those as muted users. Now that we've defined our model and our context, we need to create a migration. Now, if you don't know what a migration is, typically in a database, you have to create the table, you have to specify the columns and what the data types are, all that stuff. A migration is just an easier way to do that. .NET will do it for you. So you have to tell it to prepare those scripts. So I'm going to go ahead and run over to the console somewhere here. All right. And I'm going to type in a command to create a migration. Okay, so this requires the .NET Entity Core tools. So if you don't have those, you should, because we added that package. But if this doesn't work for you, you need to download those. I'll put the link for that in the descriptions. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling .NET to use the entity framework, that's the EF, to create a migration, or that we're using the migrations part of EF. And then we're adding a migration, so we're going to create a new migration. And then we're giving it a name, right? This is just for us. We can call this whatever we want, but it's nice to make it something that when you see it at a glance, you'll know what it was doing. So in this case, we're initializing our Sqlite database. Now, this part here you don't really need if you're only using one database, but since I'm using multiples, I have to specify which context I'm using. And since it's the Sqlite context, I'm just passing this -- context, Sqlite context. But if you're only using this Sqlite, you don't need to do that. And then we'll run it, and it should build and create our migrations for us. All right, so now you can see we succeeded. We didn't have any issues. Okay, so I didn't notice it the first time, but when I ran it the first time, it said no context name Sqlite context was found, which didn't make sense to me because it was there. But after I ran it a couple more times, it actually found it. I guess I had to run it without the command first so that it would look for it without the -- context. But the second time it found it, and it initialized it and did everything we expected. Now there's a new Sqlite folder which has our migrations, and if you click on the first one, you'll see it's named after the date and time that you did it, and then the name that you gave it, initialize SQL database. So basically all this does is it creates a set of instructions for the program to create or remove the database. So as you can see, it's got an override void up and an override void down. And what this says is when you run a migration, go ahead and create a table named muted users, and here are the columns it needs and what types they are, all that database stuff that you don't want to do. It does it here for you. And on a down, what it does is it undoes whatever it did in the up. So that way you can roll back from any mistakes or any changes that you decide you don't want. So that's all that is. That's pretty simple. So now that we have this migration file, we actually need to run it. Now, this is something you can do many different ways, but I prefer to have it done as a command in the bot, or something I manually do myself because I'm using Docker containers. But you can do this any of the other ways you can do this. But I'm going to show you how I do it. Now, I have a commands file called admin commands, and I have the permissions set to administrators only. So I have a command called migrate, which is for my Microsoft SQL database. So I'm just going to duplicate this and create one for SQLite. So I'll do that, and then I'll explain what I did. All right, so we're making a standard command. I'm calling it migrate lite because I already have a migrate. It's just like all the other commands, public async task, migrate lite is what I'm calling it. Pass it to CTX, command context. I'm writing to the console to let myself know that I'm migrating. And here's where I connect a connection. Here's where I make a connection to the database, right? So we're using await because we're in a task. And then we're using SQLite context, and we're creating a variable called lite, which is of that SQLite context. So now we have a variable called lite that we can access whenever we want to make any changes to the database. So then I have an if statement, which just says if the database has any pending migrations, right? So if there's any migrations that it hasn't applied, if it hasn't created our columns and tables and all that stuff, if any exist, then go ahead and run this command called lite database migrate async. And it's going to go ahead and create any, run through those migrations and create any of the changes that they do. And then once that's done, I send myself a message saying that this method is complete. So if I go ahead and start up my bot again, I should be able to run that with no issue. So it's booting up, and then I should get my hello message, which I already did. 946 here, 947 here. All right, so now I can come in here, and since I'm an administrator, I can type in migrate lite, and I should get back a message that says, okay, so that didn't work. And after several minutes of bashing my head against the wall, I found out that I had a typo. So, as you can see, I am looking for a date source. That's not right. We want a data source for our SQLite. So now, let's try this again. Okay, so we started up, and now let me type in migrate lite. Boom, migration complete. How wonderful, wonderful is that? All right, so that means that it went ahead and created the database. Now, if you look in my files, you'll see there's a SQLite db.db, which is the file that it created. So now we can proceed. So we've added this command, which migrates everything over, checks for migrations and does it. We've made sure that our context is pointing to the right information, data source, not date source. Now we can proceed with the functions to actually get and set users. So I'm gonna get out of my admin commands for now. I'm gonna close everything down here. And I have my fun commands where I have all my other commands. And you can put these commands wherever you want as long as it's somewhere that works. But I'm gonna just go ahead and type in the command to store a user. So let's do that real quick. Okay, so we've created a command called add mute. It is a public async task just like all the other ones. It's called add mute, it has the command context just like all the other ones. And then here we go, we're initializing a new variable called mute, which is going to be of type muted user, because we decided that back here when we created our models, it's called muted user. So we're creating a new muted user. Then we're setting its properties, right? We created these properties earlier. Member ID, we're setting that to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The muted reason is that person called me fat. And then the expiration date for that mute is going to be datetime.now plus 2 days, right? We're adding 2 days to now, and that's when that person can be unmuted. So then we're using our SQLite context. We're creating a new connection to the database here. And then we're saying lite.muted users, so all the muted users in that database. We're gonna add this new one that we just created, right? This new mute we're going to add it to our muted users table. And then we want to save that change. So we do an await light save changes async. And then we'll go ahead and get a count of all the rows in that table. So light muted users.count will give us all of our rows. And then we'll just output that message to the same channel saying there are now however many muted users. So let's go ahead and try that. So all right, the command is add mute. So we'll come in here and type in add mute. And there you go. There are now 1 muted users. Now if I go ahead and type in add mute again, there are now 2 muted users. So it's properly storing all that to the database. So that's working. Now, how do we get that stuff and how do we do things to that? So I'll go ahead and copy paste this. I'm going to create a get mutes function. So I'm just going to copy this and make a few changes. Okay, so just like before, just creating a new command. I'm calling this one get mutes. Same public async task, calling the method get mutes, command text, context, all that as usual. I'm creating a new variable here called current date. In a real life scenario, you would probably not do this. I don't see why you would. But I'm creating a variable and I'm calling it current date, but it's actually going to be in the future, right? So it's setting date time now plus 3 days. Now, if you remember when we created our users, our muted users, we're setting their ban time or their mute time for 2 days. So I want to see if it's expired. So in order to do that, I need to be past 2 days. So I'm going to set this to 3 days. So pretending that today is 3 days from today. But in a real world situation, don't do this. Just use datetime.now. So then we're going into our connection again, SQLite context.light, or light equals new SQLite context. That's doing our database connection. Everything we're doing in the database needs to be in these brackets. So in here, we're creating a new variable called all mutes, which is literally going to get all the rows in our database, in our table, and assign it to this variable. So, okay, we're going to iterate through all the users, and then we're going to do a date compare. We're going to see if today is later than the expiration date, right? Because the expiration date was 2 days, and today is 3 days after that, or 3 days after today. So today should be later than our muted expiration. And so if this is true, then this will return a 1. So we're checking for that. If current date is later than the expiration date, then do something. And so right here, I'm just going to output a message saying that I am unmuting user whatever. But this is where you would do the actual unmuting. So that's all there is to that. Let's go ahead and run it. There you go. You see, I am unmuting user 12345, and I am also unmuting user 12345. They're the same user in this case, but in a real life scenario, you would have different users, I'm sure. So that's how you do that. All right, so we're done. That's it. It was that easy. I had a couple of hurdles to run through, but that was my own fault for not spell checking. Well, you know, it's going to do the job. You can add, you can delete, you can update, you can do all that just like you would with any other entity object, any other model. So if you know how to do that, you can do this. So again, just make sure that this is the right database for you. You've got the framework in place, no pun intended, the entity framework. You can actually use that to do all the same stuff that we did here, but do it using MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server or any other database like that. So maybe look into those and understand which database you actually need before you actually commit too much time into something that's going to stall out and burn. That's all I got for you this time. Thanks again for watching. I'm Skidvis. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Join my Discord, links in the description. Become a Patreon member. Help me with my games. And that's all for this time. Peace out. I'm still SkidViz. Goodbye.